And here at the Barn Church, they are prominently displayed in the vestibule, an invitation for us to perhaps read them on our way into the sanctuary. These principles are much more. They are not just generalities. It's not like the membership rules of organizations like the Kiwanis Club. We live by these rules. I might say we embody them. Some of us have them on cards in our wallets. Maybe these days are virtual wallets. They are the stuff that convinces some people to become visitors or members of our congregational communities. Our principles have statements that fit well on banners that are carried during civil rights marches and social protest marches. They have affirmations of human rights, of environmental rights, of the rights of living things and the well-being of the planet. The first and final principles on this list act as bookends for the others. The first principle states that we affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every human being. One principle that is stated very often and paraphrased in various ways is the fifth principle. We affirm and promote the democratic process in our societies and in the world at large. It's not just something to rely on for our own petty grievances. It is much broader than that. And may we promote it for societies and in the world at large. And then the seventh principle bookend is one that is set by affirming our respect for the inherent interdependent web of existence of which we are all a part. In the history of Unitarian Universalism, there have been several theologians, social thinkers, ministers, and ordinary people. Some of them have died upholding these and similar principles, worded differently, but with similar sentiment about dignity, worth, democratic thinking. Some of that history relates to interpretation of scripture, and some of it relates to secular thinking about human rights and freedom from oppression and other things. These people are the martyrs of Unitarian Universalism. When I used to think about martyrs in a religious context, I sometimes visualized someone like St. Simon Stylites, who lived on a little platform at the top of a pole in the desert. You may have read about him. Yeah. Luckily, people brought him food that he could hoist up. Or I think about some gory paintings, like one of the ones showing Saint Sebastian pierced by many arrows. Or I might have a vision of early Christians bravely confronting lions in the Colosseum in Rome. But in our religious tradition, I find that a good, comprehensive definition of a martyr is the one that was given by the Reverend Jenny Barrington in 2017. And she used ideas from the UUA website for that. She said these words in a sermon addressing the UU congregation of Columbia in South Carolina. Using mostly her words, this says, a martyr is a person who feels a calling, some would say a divine calling, to tell and to show people how to live more caring, fair, and principled lives in relationship with each other, with the earth, with other groups, with the wider world, and according to some, with God. A martyr is someone who has died for those beliefs. But there is more. And this is crucial for us today. In her sermon, the Reverend Jenny Barrington also said that after a martyr has died, the people who had faith in that martyr are changed. Their community is changed. Indeed, in some ways, the whole world is transformed for the better. People are enlightened and feel awe and are inspired to live their best, their most ethical and caring lives that they can, individually and together. And Norbert Čapek was one of this handful of martyrs. I won't talk much about most of them. Their stories can be found easily by going to the UUA website and Googling the word martyr or Googling individual names. There's no need to go through that long list, rather. I will just pick 5, beginning with our earliest history. Let us remember that the first one who is listed, but not the first one by any means. Maybe Jesus was the first one whose words were written down in scripture, but there were others before him that you may read about in, for example, the Hebrew scriptures. But the first on my list is Origen of Alexandria, who lived from 185 in the Common Era to the year 253. He was also called Origen Adamantius, as in the English adjective adamant. He was adamant about his beliefs. He was an adamant early Universalist, believing that all can be saved. An idea that was threatening then to rulers. It's still an idea that's threatening to some rulers today. It was threatening to the Emperor Justinian, among others, and he was repeatedly tortured by a later emperor and eventually died as a result of the tortures. He was also a Unitarian, I should say, because in the first 3 centuries of Christianity, no theologian was what was later called a Trinitarian or a believer in the doctrine of the Trinity. That didn't exist then. It came later. His ideas, however, inspired later beliefs in an enduring way, and he deserves to be remembered today. Then there is maybe my favorite among the historical ones, Miguel or Michael, as we say, Servetus, who lived in a dangerous century for a theologian with liberal ideas that were different from the accepted interpretation of the scripture. He was born in 1511 and died at a relatively young age in 1553. He may also have been the leading intellectual of his time, a true genius. He was a Spanish theologian, a physician, a cartographer, many other things. He was fluent in several languages, including the languages of the Christian and Hebrew scriptures. He read those and interpreted them in their original languages. And he came to several scholarly conclusions. The first one, which was disturbing to church authorities, was that they contained no evidence of original sin. Yes, there is some evidence or some scripture about sins, if you want to call them that of Adam and Eve, but nothing that would affect you in infancy. And second, he claimed that there was no scriptural evidence of the doctrine of the Trinity. Oh my. He knew it was controversial, but he truly thought that he would be able to explain to religious authorities the errors of their beliefs. Have you ever tried to explain to an authority the error of their belief and say, but wait, I have another piece of evidence? That's not how it works. In fact, his major book was controversial just by the title. It was titled On the Errors of the Trinity. Go figure. Yeah, people in authority don't often appreciate their errors being pointed out to them, especially in the 16th century, the century when the Spanish Inquisition began. Eventually, the Inquisition caught up with Michael Servetus. He continued, even if he knew he was being persecuted, he continued to share his ideas, to write about them. Eventually, he took on a pseudonym, but that didn't help because he was writing, corresponding with the likes of John Calvin, who knew very much who he was. And John Calvin was one of the ones who urged Inquisition to go after him. Yeah. Calvin thought he was being humane by urging the inquisitors to just behead him instead of burning him at the stake. Well, that was nice. So what happened to Servetus? He was burned at the stake, with his books providing the kindling. But his books have endured, thanks to the printing press. I'm going to jump to much closer to our time, the year 1965 to be precise. It was the year when the Reverend James Reeb, who was a white assistant minister at All Souls Church in Washington, D.C., was 38 years old, and he was compelled to participate in the March for Voting Rights from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. The day called Bloody Sunday, even though it was a peaceful march on the part of those who were in the march. He was attacked by a group of white supremacist thugs who were wielding clubs, and he suffered severe head injuries, dying 2 days later. I should say that the first hospital did not admit him because he was part of the march. He had to go to another hospital 2 hours farther. In that same year, and in the same context, Viola Liuzzo was murdered. She was a local here. How many of you have heard about her? Yes. She was
a member of First UU.
Yes, yes, yes. Indeed. That's what it says in my next sentence. You took the wind out of my sails, and rightly so. She had just become a member of the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Detroit in 1964, just after the merger of the two denominations. Viola was a white woman, and her best friend was Sarah Evans, a black woman. They were inseparable, like sisters, and they were also united in their fight for civil rights. Viola was 39 years old, and she was a nursing student at Wayne State University. And she too was inspired to go to Alabama to participate in the Civil Rights March. She was shot dead by KKK members who shot her from a passing car. The deaths of James Reeb and Viola Liuzzo gave a boost to the passing of the Voting Rights Act that same year. By the way, a new monument was just unveiled for her and for Sarah Evans this past September in Detroit. Sarah Evans had stepped up to raise the children that Viola left behind. 3 children that she had with her marriage to Anthony, and 2 from his previous relationship. 5 children were raised by Sarah Evans. On the backside of that monument, which is on the west side of Detroit, this is written, and we should keep that in our hearts and our minds and our actions. The words are, it's everybody's fight. Today, of course, I particularly want to mention Norbert Čapek, who lived from 1870 to 1942. That already tells you what happened to him. He was born in a small Bohemian village in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, where Roman Catholicism was the mandatory state religion. When he reached adulthood, he became a Baptist and then turned to ministry, serving several congregations. His stance, as far as religion and social issues is concerned, became more and more liberal, and Unitarianism began to appeal to him. By the way, the Baptists also investigated him for heresy. It wasn't just the Catholics. At the beginning of the First World War, he moved to the United States, as he knew he was in danger of being arrested because of his anti-Catholic writings. He became a member of a Unitarian church in New Jersey eventually. In 1920, he moved back to what was then Czechoslovakia. And 2 years later, he had organized the Prague Congregation of Liberal Religious Fellowship. So it's a non-denominationally affiliated fellowship, an open fellowship. And that is where he designed and celebrated the first flower communion in 1923, a ritual celebrating the diversity of the beloved community. And we saw a representation in our ritual today. Eventually, Čapek received financial help from Unitarian associations in the United States and also in Britain. And with those funds, he was able to purchase a medieval palace in 1930. There were many of those. It's really a big house. Really. And there he established the Unitarian Church of Czechoslovakia that same year, 1930. It was recognized by the government, but then came the Nazi occupation. In 1941, he was arrested by the Gestapo. The charge, listening to foreign radio broadcasts. He was sentenced to 1 year in prison. And since he had already served 11 months awaiting trial, this should have been a short sentence. But the zealous Gestapo officer decided to ignore the court ruling and sent Čapek to the Dachau death camp. He was one of the many killed in the gas chamber just 4 months after his arrival there. His official death certificate said that he had had a cerebral hemorrhage. The real reason for his arrest and death, of course, was not listening to radio broadcasts. In addition to his liberal activism, Čapek had published a book with a provocative title, just like the provocative title of Servetus's book. Čapek's book was titled Toward a Sunnier Shore, and it was published in 1929. And he had the audacity, which we should admire, to republish a second edition in 1939 on the verge of World War II. In his words, the task of any church must be to place truth above tradition, spirit above any scripture, freedom above authority, and progress above all reaction. It is tragic indeed that so many individuals who were true visionaries and have inspired those around them have died violent deaths at the hands of thugs, oppressive religious authorities, and violent authoritarian regimes. But their visions, their writings, and the seeds of their service remain. We can continue to tell the stories of their lives and their service and follow their courageous examples. And that is why the flower communion is such an important and powerful ritual. Our 7 principles are rooted in the values that came out of the lives and visions of these martyrs and people like them. They continue to speak to our values of equity, justice, pluralism, fairness, democracy, and compassion. May we keep being inspired by them. May we keep their teachings and the principles that reflect their visions and their examples in our hearts. May we make it so. And let us now rise in body or spirit as we sing our closing hymn, number 346 in the Greek.